Hello, class. What I wanted to do before we go any further is to let you know how this course is organized in terms of subject matter. So we talked about physical science and the environment, and we decided that the first unit will be on the foundations of environmental science, followed by the next unit, which would be on pollution, air pollution, water pollution, different types of degradation in the environment. And the third unit would be on the conservation measures and improvements that we have done, and also some of the helpful suggestions that students at this college have volunteered in terms of improving the quality of their environment. So it's really a third section is what can we do to improve our own environment? What measures can we take? Right now, what I'd like to do is take you through the first unit, which deals with foundations of environmental science. And when we talk about environmental science, we're talking the word environment means the surroundings. And the biggest surrounding we have, of course, is the Earth itself. And we all know that the Earth is the only planet that we know of which has life on it. In fact, it's often called the biosphere, or living Earth. And so what I'd like to do is take you through some of the concepts and some of the things you will be learning about as we study the biosphere. In this color map of the world, it's color-coded to show you, represent different regions of the Earth that have different climates. And if we start at the very top, close to the North Pole, all the way around the Earth on the land, you'll notice this color. If you check the color code down at the bottom, you'll notice it says tundra. So the furthest north that we have, including the polar regions, both north and south, the condition dictates a certain type of environment that refer to as a biome, or a geographical area that contains a dominant vegetation. And for example, in this, the dominant vegetation happens to be called the tundra. Below that, another area that has of a different latitude. Of course, the Earth is arranged and marked off in lines of latitude, which indicate the distances north and south of the equator. And so the region of the Earth below the tundra would be the coniferous forest. That means all around the Earth at this approximate latitude, probably around 60 to 75 degrees north latitude, we find a certain type of living creature, a dominant vegetation, and that would be the evergreen forest. As a matter of fact, we just happen to have here a specimen of pine needles that come from an evergreen tree. In fact, there's another word that they'd like to use for the evergreen forest, or coniferous forest. Coniferous means cone-bearing, and this would be the seed. The cone carries the seed from this particular plant. So all around the Earth, at a latitude of pretty much between 50 and 75 or 80 degrees north latitude, are ringed with a forest of trees, evergreen trees. This is called the coniferous forest. This is called another biome. A biome, again, is a geographical area which contains a dominant vegetation. This is the dominant vegetation. And where you have the coniferous forest, you may have some areas that are the tundra. Now, in the tundra, the ground is frozen as a permafrost. Trees will not generally grow in the tundra. The question is why? You're going to be learning some of the physical characteristics of the tundra, and the frozen ground of the tundra does not permit the roots to penetrate the soil. So trees, large plants are generally not found there. You have another type. You have grasses and you have shrubs, and you have something called lichens, which are very, very simple plant-like creatures that grow on rocks. We even have some lichens that growing at further latitudes where we are. The thing is, it's a dominant plant in the tundra. It's not a dominant plant here. You may find lichens growing in our latitude and then also in the coniferous forest latitude. But what takes over is this type of plant, the evergreen forest. So below the evergreen forest, this sort of light brown color indicated here, and it's not always completely. If you take a look at this green region here, I think you'll take a look at down here. It says deciduous forest, and approximately at that latitude, but not always in every single geographical area, you will find a dominant type of plant, which we call the broadleaf forest. Those are the trees that we have outside. We live in a deciduous forest biome, so we have flat broadleaf trees, and they're characterized by leaf falling of the leaves during the fall season. They call it the fall season because the leaves are falling off the tree, and so that's a dominant plant in our region, which is we're at approximate latitude of about 43 degrees north latitude. So all around the earth, on the land, that type of tree dominates. And that biome would be called the deciduous or broadleaf forest biome. Below that, if you go to the southern part of the United States, this yellow color, and of course North Africa, and if you look at the yellow, it's a desert. So the southern part of the United States, Southern California, New Mexico, Arizona, all deserts. The desert is that region where you have very little rainfall, for example, and lots of sunshine, and the lack of rainfall means the number of plants that might live there are limited. So whenever we talk about biomes, we will look at what we call the biomass. That means the weight of all the plants in a given area. So you might say, well, what is the difference between the biomass in the desert and the biomass in a coniferous forest? Which one would be greater? And if you took a meter stick and measured the ground, the earth, 1 square meter, and took all the plants and animals out of that area and weighed them, you would get their mass, and that would indicate their biomass, the weight of all the living things in one region. So we see that the desert is low in biomass, it's low in biodiversity as compared with other biomes. So we're very close now, we're just above the equator, and if you go to the equator, it's about here, and I think the equator is, okay, I think the orange color indicates not sort of grasslands. What would you say at the equator? What happens at the equator? Well, you get the maximum sunshine, you get plenty of rainfall, and that combination of moisture and sun causes tremendous growth in plants. So you have all the tropical forests of the world located in the equatorial latitudes, either at 0 degrees latitude or some degrees above and below, all around the earth. So if we take a look at the color thing here, the tropical rainforest, you can see the green area. This is approximately 0 degrees around the earth. You can see the rainforests are found at 0 degrees. So this is from the North Pole to the South. What about the South Pole to the equator? The equator to the South Pole? Well, we don't have as much land in the southern hemisphere as we have in the northern hemisphere. But wherever we have land, we find the pattern is very much the same. Let's take a look at this before I even show you this slide. So what would be some of the physical conditions? For example, what could you say that it would snow at the equator? I mean, it sounds like a silly question. Does it snow at the equator when we know that the temperature is very warm and there's lots of sunlight and so on? And the question is, can it snow at the equator? And for most people, they'll say, of course it can't snow at the equator. Well, let's take a look and see what you think. This is the equator, near the equator in Africa. And what do we have here? We have snow on top of this mountain. How can that be? Well, anyone who's ever climbed the mountain knows that as you rise up above sea level, it gets colder and colder, and the climate changes. And if it's cold enough, it could, instead of rain, it could turn to snow. So what we find is that there are biomes along the side of a very tall mountain. And if you take a look at this over here, we have, let's say at sea level, it could be in the Pacific Ocean, and along the California coast you'll have an area where you'll have broadleaf trees, deciduous forest, but if you climb the mountain, you'll eventually be transition zoned into the coniferous forest where you have just cone-bearing trees. You'll have deciduous trees growing here too, but the dominant tree at a certain elevation will be coniferous forest. If you go further up, you'll go above the coniferous forest biome and you'll reach what we call the tundra, where you'll find just grasses and shrubs and lichens, which is an indicator organism of the tundra. Above that, the conditions, the climate conditions do not support the growth of any kinds of plants. And so what we have here is, as you move up the side of the mountain or as you increase in altitude, you pass through similar biomes as if you took a trip from the North Pole to the equator. So the biomes of altitude are very similar to the biomes of latitude. And one of the things about the biosphere is it has these different regions. There's one region, however, we just didn't even mention. So if we take a look at our Earth as a whole, and if there's take a picture of it from a satellite in outer space, it's largely blue, the color of the Earth. Pictures show. What's the blue? The blue, of course, is the water, is the ocean. And if you were to take a do a little test here and spin the Earth, close your eyes and touch the Earth 10 times, in most cases 7 out of 10 or 8 out of 10, very, very close to 70% of the times that you touch the Earth will indicate that it's approximately 70%. 7 out of 10, sometimes it's 8 out of 2, but the longer you do this, the closer to a 70-30 ratio you'll get, percentage you will get. So what we find that the ocean is the biggest biome, and so we need to know a little more about the ocean itself. And as you can see here in this picture here along the shore, we're very familiar with the shore. When we go down to the beach, you may put your blanket down, and on the beach here there's an area that you have to be very careful about. You may get too close to the water, you go into the water and you come back, and what happens sometimes, you may notice your blanket's going to get wet from the incoming tide. So all around the world, the ocean moves onto the land and off the land, the tide, what we call the tide. And so the highest point on the land would be the high tide, and the lowest point would be the low tide zone. And so the area along the shore has these different zones, and in the zones you have different kinds of living creatures. So we have the intertidal zone between high and low. If you go a little further out, there's a subtidal zone not shown here, but it's just below the intertidal zone. And then if you look at it, if you were to walk out, of course it gets deeper and deeper, but it's a very gradual slope here, and it may go out between sometimes 50 and 100 miles. And for every mile that you would walk, it drops 1 foot. So at the end of a typical continent, this is the continental shelf because this is the continent, we find that a given depth could be maybe between 50 and 100 feet. And then you notice that the further down the slope is much greater, resulting in an area called the continental slope. So a profile of the ocean shows these zones, these various, what they sometimes call life zones, because there's different types of living things will be found there. As a matter of fact, when you talk about life in a biome or on the Earth anywhere, we're talking about productivity. How productive are these zones? Productivity means the number of different animals and plants that you might have in a given area. So you might ask which zone here might be the more productive. And if you take a look at the neritic zone here, this area above the continental shelf, over here you have a pelagic, what they call the pelagic open ocean here, but it goes down quite far. And on the average, the depth of the ocean, on the average, runs around 3,000 meters, 4,000 meters, about 12,000 feet. And so the question is, where do you think you might find the most living things? And if you take a look at this area down at, let's say, at 3,000 to 4,000 meters versus the shallow area here, you may want to compare the productivity of those areas. Which one would be more productive? And you might say, well, how the productivity is depending upon the environmental conditions. How would they be different at the bottom of the ocean here versus the shallow areas along the shore? And you would know from experience or from experiments that as you go further down in the ocean, it gets darker and darker. In fact, on the bottom, it's pitch black. Can't see anything, very little light, except from maybe some marine animals that might be producing light. There's no light from the sun. It doesn't penetrate down that far. The average penetration of the light will be probably around 200, maybe 100 meters on the average, 300 feet. And that area where the light penetrates, with this area here, you could put in another word here called the photic zone. So the photic zone would be the area where there's light. And below the photic zone, you would have another area called the aphotic zone, which means no light. So these are some of the conditions we need to know, we're going to learn, we're going to talk about when we talk about the ocean. Which area would have high, when you say productivity, productivity is measured in two units, one called biomass and the other one called biodiversity. Biodiversity means how many different kinds of living things we find in one area, and biomass means the total weight of all the living things in a given area. So you'd want to compare these. And of course down here the conditions for life are very slim. We have very, very dark, since there's no light down there. When there's no light, there's no life in general, because light produces life. Light is absorbed by green plants. They make food and oxygen. Animals feed on that. Plants also use that material. And so where there's light, there's more productivity. Just when we thought there was no life on the very, very deep things, we actually found, and we're going to see in a few minutes, in fact, there is life in areas where there's no light. And we're going to get to that in a few minutes. So this would be a profile of the ocean. We're going to take a look at some of the physical areas a little more during the turn. And let's take a look at this now. So whenever we have living creatures, we have an important interaction between animals and plants. And much of that involves different types of energy. For example, in photosynthesis, if you look here, we have this formula equation for photosynthesis. And CO2, if you can take a look at this, is CO2 and water in the presence of sunlight, and usually green material, chlorophyll, which they don't have here, but it would be part of that process, produces, this is the formula for glucose plus oxygen. So one of the most important chemical reactions in the biosphere is photosynthesis, the production of glucose and oxygen. All the oxygen that we breathe in comes from green plants, either water plants or land plants. The question is, which ones produce more? Actually, more oxygen is coming from the water plants than the land plants. And by the water plants, we just don't mean seaweeds. We mean all the microscopic algae that grows on the surface of the ocean from the surface down to 200 feet, 300 feet, all around the world. So it's a huge amount of oxygen that's produced, gets into the atmosphere, and we breathe it in. So photosynthesis is not only very important for plants to carry on, animals depend, obviously their whole lives depend upon the production of the energy, glucose and oxygen here. And so following this, after the oxygen is produced, we breathe it in, we take the food in, the glucose. So actually there's another reaction where the oxygen combines with the glucose in the cells of your body to produce carbon dioxide, water, and energy in the form of heat. And also another type of energy called chemical energy, called ATP, which is needed by cells of the body, in particular the nerve cells and the muscle cells, because they're the most active tissue in the body and they require ATP. ATP is energy that comes originally from the glucose molecule. Okay? And the glucose molecule comes from the green plant use of carbon dioxide and water. So we have a very important interaction here between photosynthesis and aerobic respiration. They call it aerobic because it uses oxygen. There can be production of energy without oxygen, called anaerobic. And we have cells in our body that work that way. And there are also creatures that carry on anaerobic. Most creatures that we are familiar with, our common animals and plants, are breathed by aerobic respiration. So you may look at this again and you can see they're really opposites. Photosynthesis produces glucose and oxygen. Aerobic respiration burns it up in the cells of the body and produces the energy. And you can look at it in terms of energy transfer. In photosynthesis, you have something that we didn't put in here and we should put in here, very, very important. You need light here. I guess with the energy in, I don't know what that refers to, but normally it's CO2 plus H2O in the presence of light. So we should indicate that that energy means light. And so there's a transfer of energy from radiant energy into the glucose molecule, which contains chemical energy. So photosynthesis shows a transfer of energy from light into chemical. And the chemical energy is in the form of bonds, electrochemical bonds that are found between carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and hydrogen. This carbon-hydrogen bonds are very, very powerful. And also there's also energy. And so when this is taken into the body, the molecule of glucose is broken down, which means the bonds are broken and they release their energy. And the energy that is released helps to form the ATP that's produced here at the end, plus the heat energy that's given off as well. So these are two very important reactions that go on among living things. Okay, class, just when we thought that life needs light, we discovered a number of years ago that there's life in areas of the ocean so deep that light can't penetrate. And scientists have been in these very special vehicles called submersibles, and it's like an underwater submarine, and they've been looking at different areas on the ocean floor, and there's one particular area that's of great interest to the scientists. It's an area in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. If I can show you this, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean there is a mountain range. The longest mountain range in the world is found underwater. And it goes from the North Pole to the South Pole. Yeah, if we take a look at this here, North Pole, South Pole, this is a mountain range. Mid-Atlantic Ridge, they call it. Because it's underwater, goes all the way down to the South Polar area. And it lies about on the average about 2,000, maybe 2,000 feet below the surface. So, for example, in this picture of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge here, there's hot molten lava or magma that comes out. Sometimes volcanic activity occurs. If not, the water that's inside the rock material is heated and it spews forth, called a hydrothermal vent. So when they brought the submersibles in that area, they can't get too close here because the temperature would melt anything metallic. In fact, they put thermometers here to measure the temperature and melted the thermometer, the metal thermometer. So they get further down the hill, down this mountain range with the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and they found the temperatures were more moderate. And they found living creatures, all kinds of really weird-looking creatures. We would say weird because very unusual. Giant clams, different types of marine invertebrates, soft-bodied animals, even some fish with unusual physical characteristics. And they were wondering, how do they feed? How do they eat? There's no light, so there can't be any algae plants to feed on. So they took some samples back with them and they studied them, the chemical makeup of these materials, and they found that there were bacteria present in the animals as well as in the sediments that were found around the animals. And they analyzed these bacteria and they found that the bacteria were capable of reacting with various chemicals in the water to produce glucose. So if you look at this equation here, we have a chemical reaction where carbon dioxide plus water plus hydrogen sulfide, which is a compound that comes out and is found in this area, which is a product of the hydrothermal vent effluent that comes out. you have this formation of hydrogen sulfide, and this combination of chemicals they found out was produced sugar, glucose, and sulfuric acid is produced also. Very, very acidic environment, very harsh environment, but still some of these organisms could live. And this is catalyzed by the presence of bacteria. This process is called chemosynthesis because it's taking chemicals or synthesize or react together to produce a larger compound called glucose, sugar. And the sugar is the energy upon which these organisms survive. So this is something new, and scientists continue to examine and probe and explore these areas to find out a little more about life in the deep. So let's move on. And we have life on the deep, but we also have life on the surface. And one of the important things is the fact that the biosphere, the Earth itself, is so dependent upon natural resources that the Earth possesses, that the Earth needs to keep. So when these natural resources are used or they're involved in various activities on the surface of the Earth, they can't be eliminated. They have to be used again over and over again. And so what we find on the surface of the Earth is various very important ecological cycles. And this is a cycle right now which many of you are very familiar with because we're exposed to it all the time, and as it rains, okay, we have rainfall from clouds. There's enough moisture in the cloud. The particles of water that are in the cloud are so close together that they're heavy and they fall. Can fall as rain or snow or hail or sleet. All these forms are referred to as precipitation, and they fall to the ground. And if you trace these down from the ground, and they move downward toward the ocean. The ocean really is at something called sea level. So the ground is above sea level. So whatever falls on the surface of the Earth has a tendency to move towards the oceans. So all this rainwater comes down into rivers or ponds and eventually run off from the land, and it goes back into the ocean. Now in the ocean is exposed to the sunlight, and especially in areas where it's quite warm, very sunny, there's a change, a chemical change from the water molecules. The water, liquid water, is changed into a gas, water vapor, which rises up, and as it does so, it cools down, forming these clouds. And so what we have here is a process of recycling of one of the most important natural resources that we have, and that's good old H2O, water. And it involves stages. It can start with any one of these stages. If you start with precipitation, the next stage is evaporation, followed by condensation. If you start with evaporation, the next process is condensation, followed by precipitation. But as you can see here, nature recycles its natural resource, water. Another interesting, important cycle involves a very important element that we find in our bodies. All the elements on the Earth are cataloged and written up in the form of a periodic table of elements. And we have here all the elements, the natural elements, and as well as radioactive elements. And we have approximately 92 elements that are in the Earth's crust, soil, water, human body. So whatever is in the soil in terms of elements are also found in the human body. Not in the same numbers, different amounts. But one of the most important elements in the body is the element nitrogen. And you may recall from some early science, perhaps, that nitrogen is found in proteins. It's a very important element in the protein molecule. Proteins are nutrients. The protein is a nutrient found in food. There are 7 nutrients found in food, and the element, the compound protein, which is a compound because it's made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And so the nitrogen is a very important element in that protein molecule. And the protein is found in animals and plants. And we eat foods that are high in protein, such as meats and many types of vegetables, seeds in particular in plants. But it kind of starts with the plants. As the animal eats the plant, the plant gives up its molecules of protein, not necessarily protein, which is broken down into its units called amino acids. But to make a long story short, the nitrogen that's in the protein has to come from somewhere. And so the carbon and the hydrogen, we know where that comes from carbon dioxide, and the hydrogen from water. But where does the plant get its protein from? Where does it get its nitrogen from to make proteins? The plant makes proteins. Animal eats the proteins. So the nitrogen transfers from the plant to the animal. So the question is, where does the nitrogen come from? And it's very interesting. The nitrogen is also found in dead matter. So whenever animals or plants die, they become part of the soil or in the water, and they are decomposed by bacteria called decay bacteria. And they're decomposed into some very, very important substances. One of them is called nitrates, but you can see this over here, which has the formula NO3. It's a negatively charged ion, and it's very reactive. Okay? In fact, if you look at the arrow here, the dead matter, which is in the ground, the bacteria break down the dead matter into nitrates, and the nitrates are passed up into the roots. They're absorbed by the roots, and they are passed up into the plant where the plant manufactures protein. The animal, the rabbit, feeds the plant, and so you have a cycle here. When the animal dies, its body is decomposed and decayed by other bacteria, so you have this nitrogen cycle, like this. You also have other elements produced along with nitrates, including ammonium, and nitrites. Now, these two particular products of decay, unfortunately, they have the element nitrogen in here, which can be used by the plants, but they can't be absorbed directly by the plants because they're toxic. And so there are other bacteria in the soil that will break down these two to actually convert them into nitrates. So all of this involves a cycle of moving nitrogen, and we call this the nitrogen cycle. Very, very important because it's a source of proteins for all living creatures. And not only do living creatures depend upon their environment, they depend upon each other. There are relationships between living things and other living things. Here is one, if you can take a look at it. We have a plant here, and feeding on the plant is the caterpillar. And the frog eats the caterpillar, so there's an arrow that goes from the food is moving along from one animal to the next. The snake may catch the frog, and so the food from the frog passes to the snake, and eventually the owl may feed on the snake. So what we have here in nature is one of many, many food chains where one organism serves as food for another. So nature has cycles, and it has these linear relationships of food chains. Here is one in the ocean. You look at this one, you can see that there is an organism called a phytoplankton, which is a microscopic green plant, very small, that is green, so it carries out photosynthesis, makes food. And the food is eaten by a small animal that lives with the phytoplankton, called the zooplankton. These are animals that will grow up to become many of the marine animals we find in the ocean, the clams, the oysters, the fish. Their embryonic stages are all in the water, growing up in the water as zooplankton, and they mature into the larger animals, adult forms. But while they're embryonic, they serve as food for small fish. The big fish eats the small fish, and here this mammal looks like a orca, a killer whale, feeds on that. Okay, so here you have another kind of food chain. And if you look at the food chains, you can analyze them in terms of various relationships. Like, for example, which organism in this particular food chain could you say is the most abundant? In fact, there are some questions here we could answer. Which organism has the lowest concentration of chemical energy? Now, looking at that, a lot of people are going to say the lowest concentration of chemical energy is probably the phytoplankton because it's so small. And the answer to that question is no, it's not the lowest. It's the highest. It has more chemical energy pound for pound than a pound of flesh from an orca whale. How is that? Well, if you look at it carefully, it takes its energy directly from the sun. There's no loss. It goes from the sun directly into the cells of the plant. So it's very concentrated. Each cell has more concentrated glucose or energy or ATP than the cells of these animals. Now what happens after it has this glucose? It's eaten by, let's say, the zooplankton, okay? And the zooplankton is moving around, it's swimming around, so it's using up the energy. So as it moves from one to the next, there's an energy loss along the way. And that energy loss means the concentration of the flesh is going to be less and less at every level. And that may help to explain why the animals that tend to be at the end of the food chain are generally much larger. Why are they larger? Because the food that they eat to begin with is not that much energy in it, so they have to eat a lot. So in eating a lot, they get bigger. So that tends to be the relationship here in almost all food chains. Here's another question. Which organism is the least numerous? And that would be, what do you think? This would be the orca whale. Why the orca? Why is it least numerous? Why are there more phytoplankton than orca whales? Well, let's take a look at the animal that feeds on it. There has to be more phytoplankton than zooplankton. What would happen if there were more zooplankton than phytoplankton? The zooplankton would eat all the phytoplankton up and would end the food chain. So there are always more producers than consumers. And we've discovered that as a result of all these food chain relationships we have. We have another one here in the ocean. And here it asks you to, and then you can do this later on, is to make up a food chain based on what you see here. What kinds of organisms would you have? And I think we have one more. Okay, we sometimes look at the food chains, and then sometimes you describe them as food pyramids or food triangles, because you can put them into such a arrangement based on their numbers. So there's more producers than consumers, so the base of the triangle would have the plants, whereas the apex of the triangle would have the least numerous, in this case would be the predator, the owl. In fact, they said there's nothing that eats the owl. There's no animal that feeds directly under normal conditions. There are no animals that go after. Well, you might say maybe some cats if they can catch them, but it's unlikely. So there tends to be animals that end the food chain. I think if we go back and look at this one, the orca ends its food chain because there's no animal normally goes after it. They say, well, some sharks might. But under normal conditions, the sharks tend to stay away from the orca. The orca has a nasty reputation. So this is called an apex predator, APEX. And you can see the apex part of the triangle or the pyramid. They call it, it really is a triangle here, but a three-dimensional triangle really is a pyramid because it has another side over here and another side. It has 1, 2, 3. How many sides in this pyramid? It would be 4 sides. Each side is a triangle, so it would be the same thing. Okay, and finally we see that the food chains are interconnected, forming a food web, and this is a food web here. So for example, the algae here are eaten by turtles, feed on algae, but small invertebrates do also, and some fish do as well. And at the same time, the fish are consumed by a predatory animal, the shark. And so you find that food chains interconnect with each other, forming a food web. So food webs are really the ideal situation in the ocean. It's just that we study food chains because they make them up. It's easy to study a food web by analyzing the individual chains that make up. Okay, now we have relationships that involve change over time. And you see many examples of forest fires, of earthquakes, where the land is certainly devastated and destroyed completely, so all the plants and all the animals in a given area are wiped out overnight. What happens to that area that's destroyed eventually over time? And so we have records indicating that there are changes over time. And one of the changes is the appearance of, gradual appearance of different living things. And depending upon the geographical area, if it's a place where there is a forest, what would be the first type of plant that might appear to return to that area that was devastated by the fire? And of course, in that area you have, in some areas you have grasses, because grasses are normally found in forests, okay? And the grasses will completely cover the area for a long period of time, and eventually they'll change the soil in such a way that shrubs may grow in the area, okay? And then the grasses don't disappear, they're with the shrubs. And eventually over time you may find some larger shrubs and some eventually trees. So what we have here is an example of change over time by plant communities, and this is called ecological succession. And you can have succession over time, and you can have also succession over space. So if you go down to the beach in an area where there's no developments, and you were to walk on the beach inland, on these beaches that you might find where there's nobody living, no homes, no development, what kind of plant would you find first? You'll actually find beach grasses. And if you go further in, you'll find shrubs. And then finally you'll find trees. And all of these trees have so much roots that they hold the soil together in hills and what we call dunes. And so we have another type of succession where community follows a plant community, one community follows the other over a distance, over a space. Then we also have relationships where organisms stay in contact with one another, or they hang out with one another for periods of time. And here's one typical example here. You may have seen this in aquarium stores, or maybe at museums, where you find this tropical fish, colorful fish called the clownfish, and it's living among the tentacles of an animal called the sea anemone. The sea anemone sits on something and has these tentacles, arms that come around, swing around. And unfortunately for some organisms, these tentacles have stinging cells that shoot out like little microscopic arrows that shoot out into the tissue of the animal that comes in contact and may paralyze it. And so the food is brought down into the mouth, which is at the base of these tentacles. But not the clownfish. The clownfish is immune to the sting of the tentacles of the sea anemone. And so they hang out with the sea anemone. So here is a relationship that lasts the whole lifetime of the sea anemone and the fish. It may swim out, come around, and come back, but tends to hang out its whole lifetime in the area of the sea anemones. So that's unusual, and they're completely different animals. This is a vertebrate, a fish. This is an invertebrate, hanging out together. What do they have in common? What makes them attracted to each other? We find that in nature there are what we call symbiotic relationships, where organisms of different species live in close association. And that's what we have here, an example of symbiosis. Now in some cases it could be mutual, both benefit. In this case, both benefit. The sea anemone benefits. How does the sea anemone benefit by having the clownfish nearby? It's a good question. The clownfish could attract other fish that are not immune, and so the sea anemone might be able to grab them. Okay. How does the clownfish benefit? It's protected by the tentacles, so predators won't come after it. So here you have both organisms benefiting. Let's see what that. Here's another one. Here's the whale, and you may notice on whales there's all these barnacles living on the skin of the whale, and the whale doesn't seem to care one way or the other. They're swimming around, diving, jumping up in the air, and all. And yet you have all these creatures which are invertebrate. They're like shellfish. They have little movable appendages that come out and feed on plankton in the water, and they're just attached to the animal. And apparently scientists haven't found out any way that they hurt the whale, and they haven't found any way they help the whale. So this is a case where the shell, the oyster, the barnacle, the question is, it's not hurt. The question is it helped by being on the whale? Does it help the barnacle to be on the whale? And the question is yes, because barnacles must attach to hard substrate. And if they can attach to the whale, they have a place to get the plankton from as the whale moves around. So they go on long trips with the whale, and they can pick up plankton very soon. So the barnacle benefits, but scientists have not found out that benefit of the whale. They haven't found that it hurts the whale either. So here's a special kind of symbiosis called commensalism. So we're going to be looking at examples of commensalism. There are many different kinds of commensalism. So we'll be looking at that. And finally we have this thing here, this creature, which is called a tick, T-I-C-K. And as you can see here, it's attached to the skin of a person. Person is the host. The tick carries bacteria in its body. So when it attaches to the skin of the person, they really want the blood from the person. They extract the blood, but in the process they give out bacteria, and those bacteria are harmful bacteria called pathogens. And this particular harmful pathogenic bacteria can cause Lyme disease. You may have heard of Lyme disease. It's very common in the Northeast. L-Y-M-E. It's based on a town in Connecticut called Lyme, Connecticut, where they first found and diagnosed this condition called Lyme disease a number of years ago. And so the question is, what kind of relationship? They hang out with you for a while, so would this be symbiosis? And the answer would be yes, it would be symbiosis, because you have organisms of different species attached to one another. Is it helpful? Is it a helpful symbiosis for both, which is called mutualism? Like the clownfish and the sea anemone is an example of mutualism. Is this mutualism? Well, I don't know. Does the tick benefit? Yes. Do we benefit? Does the host benefit? And you'd have to say, no, it doesn't. Is it commensalism, where the human is neither affected by it, and you can say, no, it definitely is hurt by the tick. So here you have another example of symbiosis called parasitism, where one benefits, the tick, and the other person is harmed by the association. By the way, it's not the tick that's the parasite. It's the bacteria in the tick that would be, technically speaking, the parasite in that relationship. I believe that comes to the end for our first unit on the environment as it is today. And now we understand some relationships in this foundations unit. We are now ready to go and see what is wrong, what has gone wrong with our environment in the second unit, which is called pollution. So we're going to look at what we have been doing to our environment to cause its degradation, and that's the next unit.